New Year's Eve is almost here, and what better way to celebrate than to paint this adorable kitten in a winter hat? So for this lesson, these are all the standard materials I'll be using today. I have a selection of brushes, pencil, pen, a kneaded eraser, a rubber cement pickup. I have masking fluid, some opaque white, just in case I need to fix anything, my standard paints, paint palette, and sponge. If you need a list of these supplies, it is in the video description. These are the paint colors I'll be using today, so take a moment to pause the video and gather your colors. I have Payne's Gray, Ultramarine Blue, Cerulean Blue, Yellow Ochre, and Alizarin Crimson. You'll find a list of these colors in the video description. You don't need these exact colors, just use whatever you have and get close. Also in the video description is a line drawing as well as a reference photo that you can download and print at home. Once you've printed your line drawing, print it to the scale you wish to paint it. And on the back, you can take a pencil and apply graphite all over the back of the line drawing. Position it so the graphite is touching the top of your watercolor paper and tape it in position so it does not shift. You can then use a ballpoint pen and trace your line drawing. With just the pressure of your pen, it's going to help push that graphite down into your watercolor paper so you have a line drawing on your watercolor paper to begin. A less labor-intensive method would be to get some drafting paper or graphite paper, position it graphite side down in between your line drawing and watercolor paper, and you can skip this step entirely and simply trace your line drawing that way. Either system works. I did not trace every single line. I just traced what lines I thought would be helpful. You can do as many or as few as you'd like. You'll also notice that I extended the body of my cat just to better fit my 5x7 watercolor block. That's completely optional. Once your line drawing is transferred, I like to take a kneaded eraser to help clean up any pencil smudges that might have occurred during the transferring. Since this kitten is white, I'm going to want to make sure that a lot of the pencil lines related to the kitten's body and fur are very, very light. The hat is going to be such a dark, vibrant color that I'm not worried about the pencil lines on the hat. The nose, the mouth, the eyes are also areas where I'm going to be using dark paint, so I'm not worried about those lines either. Everything else around the cat, I'm definitely going to lighten, because even with the smallest amount of watercolor wash over top of pencil, you will not be able to erase these lines later. So if you don't want your lines to be very visible, I recommend taking the time to lighten any lines in the areas where you have very soft, faint values. Now, I would like to begin by painting the bottom ground area below my kitten. So in order to do that, I'm going to apply masking fluid along the bottom edge of my cat's body. In order to protect my tools, though, I put a small amount of dish soap in a small cup of water so I can coat my brush with soapy water. This will help provide a layer of protection between my tools and my masking fluid. I'm now going to go into my kitten just along the bottom, and I'm going to apply masking fluid to protect it. However, I want you to note that I am applying my masking fluid in a way that kind of encourages texture of fur. So I'm not just doing a very smooth curve on the bottom edge of my kitten. I'm making a point to apply it in the direction that I see the fur is going in, so that my animal will look fuzzy even on the bottom. And you can make your cat as fuzzy or as short hair as you would like. But this kitten reminds me of a cat I used to have, so I'm going fuzzy. So I've re-rinsed my brush. I don't let masking fluid sit on my brush for too long, or it could potentially dry. And without me realizing it, it could end up sticking to my brush and won't be able to rinse out. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. So I'm now just going back and making sure that I have solid coverage in my masking fluid and that I didn't accidentally leave any gaps between my little hair textures. I usually try to apply my masking fluid relatively thick. So I have about 1/8 of an inch to almost 1/4 of an inch of space, just to make sure I don't accidentally apply paint in an area where I don't want it. So while that masking fluid is drying, I'm now going to take a moment to mix up the colors I plan on using for the ground below my kitten. I'm going to go with a really soft baby blue. So I'm going to use a large round number 8 brush. I'm going to put as much clean water as my brush will hold into an area on my palette. I won't need a huge amount because I'm not painting on a large scale. And since I want this color to be on the lighter side, I don't need a whole lot of paint either. So it is about 50-50 paint and water. And I feel like that's the value that I would like. So I'm going to go ahead and just give this masking fluid time to dry, and I'll begin. Once the masking fluid is completely dry, I'm going to use my large round brush and get some clean water on it. And I'm going to apply a layer of clean water just on the ground floor below my kitten. I'm going to go up and around the ear. And I am going to extend the water to go up the side, next to the hat. And although I don't plan on bringing color up this far, I want my ground color to kind of fade and disappear into the white background. So having the water up this side edge is going to help me create that effect. I'm fairly heavy-handed with the application of water. I don't want it to dry too fast. So I want everything to be very, very glossy, but I do want the water to be thin enough to see the texture of the watercolor paper. If my water is standing in such thick puddles that I can't see the texture of the paper, then I know that I need to dry my brush and soak up some of that excess water before I begin this next step. So just check your water, make sure it's the right amount. That's half the battle in watercolors. Now that everything is nice and glossy, and you can kind of see it here, now I'm going to go ahead and add the color to my ground floor. So I'm going with this baby blue. I'm going to go up and around the ear as planned. But I'm just going to do a horizontal line just past the ear. And that's as far as I'm bringing the color. Now, if I have puddling of paint at the bottom edge of my block, I'm going to dry my paintbrush using a sponge or paper towel, and I'm going to use my dry brush to tap the surface of those thicker puddles of paint just to soak up the excess. Now, right below my kitty, I want to have just a hint of a shadow. So I'm going to get some ultramarine blue, and I'm going to add some of that cerulean blue to it. And it's going to be relatively dark. And that's the color I plan on using as a shadow. So right below my kitten, I'm going to add this shadow right up against the body and right below that paw. Now, if you're bothered by the paint traveling down and creating these vertical little textures, you can simply rinse your brush, dry your brush on a sponge or paper towel, and with this, you can then take your brush along that edge and clean up that edge so it has less texture. Either way, though, it's going to be fun. Now, I can't move on to the fur until I remove the masking fluid from the areas of the fur below the cap, so I need to allow this layer to dry. If you want to accelerate the process, then just grab a blow dryer. Once the ground is completely dry, take either your fingertips and rub with firm pressure to peel up the masking fluid, or you can use a rubber cement pickup, which is beneficial because the masking fluid flakes tend to want to clump up and stick to the edges, so it just kind of helps with some of the mess. And if you're not aware, masking fluid is not meant to sit on your watercolor paper for extended periods of time. If you feel like life might interrupt you and you won't be able to get back to your painting for another week or so, make sure you remove your masking fluid before you walk away. Otherwise, it is highly possible that the masking fluid will permanently adhere to your watercolor paper. And when you sit back down to paint a week later, you just might not be able to get the masking fluid up and you may have to start over. So just learn from my mistakes and try to avoid that. All right, so I'm going to brush this masking fluid away, making sure I didn't leave any behind. Now, the rubber cement pickup very much likes to lift the graphite as well as the masking fluid. So if I need to, I can come in with a pencil and just very lightly kind of reestablish some of the pencil lines that I had there previously. That way I don't get lost. Now I'm choosing to paint the kitten first. There's all kinds of wonderful fur texture and striping that is on the face of the kitten, but I don't want to accidentally bring that striping up into the hat. So to just give me peace of mind and to make the process easier, I'm going to put a layer of masking fluid on the bottom edge of the hat so I don't have to worry about that. So I'm going to get my masking fluid out again. I'm just using a small round brush, and I'm making sure to coat it with soapy water again. And I'm going to go along the bottom edge of this hat with my masking fluid. I'm going to rinse all the soapy water out of my brush really good, making sure no soap is left in there so I don't accidentally mix that soapy water in with my paint. All right, so with white fur on any animal, there's a lot of really wonderful reflected color. The reference photo I'm using for this particular kitten has the color primarily bright white, but because I am someone who just loves subtle, playful colors in the paintings, I'm going to be adding some really washed out pinks, yellows, and blues to be adding to my kitten's fur as a base layer. So to make that happen, I'm going to use a large round brush. And I'm going to apply just a small amount of water in a few different wells. One of them I'm going to add that yellow ochre to, and I'm making sure to add enough water so that it is just a very, very faint glaze of color. So what I mean by faint is this here. I'm going to do the same thing with my alizarin crimson. I want just a real faint color. So this is kind of the color I've mixed up, just barely visible. And lastly, I'm going to add just a little bit of that cerulean blue. And I think lastly, I'm going to mix up a really watered down version of that Payne's Gray. Payne's Gray is a very strong pigment, so it takes barely any paint and it just wants to turn everything real dark fast. So I have to make a point to really water down my Payne's Gray far more than I would any other color because it is such a strong pigment. So this is the gray I'm going for, really, really light. So a very soft blue, soft gray, very soft yellow and pink. In the time it took me to mix those colors, my kitten and the masking fluid on the hat have dried. So I'm going to take clean water, not my dirty water, and I'm going to apply clean water all over the body and head of my kitten. And I'm going to try and get close to the ground without actually touching the ground, which is not easy. And you might be thinking, well, why not apply masking fluid to the ground so you don't run the risk of your fur running into it? And that's true. I could do that. However, I've learned that even after the paint has completely dried, when you apply masking fluid over top of dry paint, when you peel that masking fluid up later, it tends to want to lift some of that paint, creating a faint, softer value where it originally sat. So I just don't want to risk accidentally lifting some of the color of my shadows. So I'm just going to bring my water as close to that bottom edge without having to use masking fluid to protect. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. So before I start bringing in my color, I'm just going to take a moment to kind of push some of this water into some of the fur texture. And I know it's very hard to see when the water's clean like this. But I've also learned that if you let water sit on your watercolor paper, wherever the edge of your water is, if you don't push it right up against the edge of your subject, it's possible that you might end up getting this little white line established where your water edge ended. So to avoid that, I try to get my water as close to the edge as possible in all these little fur textures along the bottom. All right, so at the low points of my paper, I have some areas where it's already puddling. So to make that water a little bit more even, I'm going to dry my brush, soak up any of the excess puddling water before I bring in some of my color. Now I'm going to grab that really soft yellow ochre, and just across the top of the nose and across the cheek below the eyes, I'm going to apply a little bit of this color. I'm also going to apply some of this soft yellow in the area of the neck, between the paw and the head. I'll apply just a little few taps along the bottom edge of the paw. And then I'm going to grab my really soft alizarin crimson. And I'm going to apply this just near the cheeks because I think that'll be cute. And I'm just kind of double checking my photo to see if there's any other fun places I could do this. I could put this in the ears, this soft pink. Now, once you have color in a couple areas, you'll be able to see whether or not that color goes right up to the edge of where the bottom color is. And you might have to push it up a little further just so you don't have a break in the color. I'm now going to grab that really soft watered down cerulean blue. And right below the hat, there's going to be some reflective color because the hat's going to be blue. So on the white fur, I want to make sure that I get just a subtle tint of blue below the hat. I'm also going to do the same thing along the bottom of the kitten because that white fur is right up against the blue ground or carpet, whatever it's laying on. And so there should be just a little bit of that reflected color along the bottom of my animal. I'm going to dry my brush and use my dry brush to kind of push some of these subtle colors down into that fur texture where maybe my water didn't extend. If some of the blue from the hat is kind of creeping down on the face, I can just use my dry brush to push that back. Now, the body of my kitten is already beginning to dry. So I'm going to quickly get in with just some of that really faint gray. And when we first apply it, it's going to look really, really strong. And it might be a little shocking. But we got to remember that watercolors will fade to be about 20% lighter when they dry. So before things begin drying, I'm just making a point to get some of this color on my kitten, indicating some of the stripes that I might want. I can add a little bit of shadow underneath the head so it pops more. Same with beneath the paw. I know we don't have the full arm drawn in our line drawing, but... And then at the very top of the kitten, before this dries, I'm going to use my brush to create a fur-like texture with this soft wash of gray, so it just doesn't look flat. Now, if some of that gray is creeping into the head of your kitten, just clean your brush and dry it, and use your dry brush to kind of drag along the edge of your chin to help control how far that soft gray travels. I'm going to do the same thing above the eyes. So I'm just taking a moment to pause and look at my kitten, see if there's any other areas where I might want just a little bit of subtle color. Just adding small touches of soft blues where it might be fun. I'm going to add really soft, subtle yellows. But otherwise, I feel like the rest of it I can fill in and establish on the next layer when I paint wet on dry. So I'm going to hit this with the blow dryer and go to the next layer. Now that everything is completely dry, I can go in and paint some of this fur texture, painting wet on dry. So I'm going to start with that really soft Payne's gray that we used in the body of the cat when it was wet. I'm just going to load my brush and wipe away the excess. And I'm going to slowly start building values on this kitten. So right above the nose, we have a lot of bristle fur. So I like to just use the end of my brush to just kind of tap little dots above the nose of the kitten. This is a great way to establish the shorter hairs that are on an animal by their nose. I'm also going to use this soft gray to establish some of the really faint, short little hair textures that I see near the eye. And note the direction of my hair texture. We want to always kind of do our best to try and follow the hair direction when we're painting animals. I'm going to use this light gray to establish where the whiskers are coming out on the cheek. So I'm not painting the whiskers themselves, but there's usually these dotted lines that go across the cheek of our animal where the whiskers will come out of later. So I'm just trying to establish a little bit of that texture. I'm going to use some of this soft gray near the ear as well. The hairs by the ear are a little longer, so my line work is going to be longer as well. Right above the nose, we have a darker stripe. So I'm going to use small line work that is going up towards the hat to establish that stripe. So just think of it as little tick marks. And I'm trying to leave space in between my marks. And if I run into that masking fluid, it's okay. It's there to protect the hat, and that's exactly why I put it there. Right above the eye, there's another stripe. However, the fur direction when it's above the eye is kind of curving out towards the ear. So my hair direction is a little different and it's more at a diagonal. I'm working with that same soft gray, and just above the opposite eye, I'm going to establish a similar stripe. There's this really cute stripe that kind of goes along the side of the head. I'm now going to go below the chin of the kitten and just get a little bit of hair texture. So just think of it as adding little whiskers. I'm going to continue with some of this fur texture to create some stripes that go along the back of the cat. I'm going to add some fur texture in front of the paw, just so we have enough contrast. And right now, my color of gray looks really dark on camera, but that's just because it's kind of sitting in a little bit of a puddle. But if I were to dry my brush and use my dry brush to help soak up the puddles, you'll notice that I'm still working with a very, very soft value of gray. It's not as dark as it appears when it's wet. So I'm just kind of creating some fun fur texture and following the contour of the kitten's arm. And I know our instinct is to be making the fur texture perfect with straight little lines. However, that's not what we're going to find in nature. So try to resist making everything so perfect and symmetrical, and try to just embrace having the texture, because that's actually what's going to help your animal look more realistic. And it comes with practice. It's not going to happen on your first pet portrait. So just be patient with yourself and your journey. I'm going to use a little bit of this gray to establish kind of the area in between the toes, but I don't want to just draw a line. So I'm kind of tapping my brush and creating texture to go in between the toes so it still reads as fur. Creating some stripes on the arm of the kitten, but any stripe I create, I am trying to follow the contour of that arm so it gives a little bit more dimension. Just adding some texture to the chest of the cat between the head and paw. And on the cheek of the cat, I'm just going to be very, very faint with just a couple lines, just so it doesn't look like an area that was forgotten about. Okay, so while that layer is drying, I'm going to add more Payne's Gray to my mixture. So it is a darker value now. So I'm now working with this color instead of this lighter color. And I'm not going to darken up every stripe. I'm going to be selective with it. So I want there to be just a hint of different values in each stripe of the fur. If there's ever an area where you feel like, oh, a little too dark, just tap with a paper towel to pick it up. So I'm just using little tick marks, trying to be selective. They're not going everywhere. I'm going to add just a little bit more bristle fur to above the nose. And although it might look black right now, it's again just my paint sitting in a puddle, so it appears much darker than it actually is. So I'm not going to worry about it. As it dries, I know it'll settle down. Just doing a couple little fur textures on a few select areas where the whiskers will be. And I'm just creating a little bit of fur texture, which would be kind of in the, I don't know what to call it, but a tear duct area of the eye. So that inside area. Continuing with this darker gray, I'm being selective. I'm not going everywhere. Just a few areas. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I'm going to return to the center stripe on the cat's head, because as it's about halfway up, the stripe does get quite a bit darker. And the stripes that are near the underside of the hat are also going to be slightly in shadow. So I'm not afraid to kind of darken up some of those areas as well. I'm going to use a really watered down gray to get some real faint, soft texture on the paw. So I'm just making sure that the hair growth is kind of curving down and over the paw. But I just don't want this little area to look like it was forgotten about. So I'm going to return to the area of the eyes. And I'm using that darker Payne's gray. And I made sure to, when I dipped my brush in the paint, I tapped a sponge or paper towel before coming to my painting, because I want to make sure that my brush isn't overloaded with too much paint. Otherwise, I won't be able to get these thin, wispy lines using just the end of my brush. If your brush is overloaded with paint and holding too much, it's going to want to make these really wide lines. So just be aware of how much paint you put on. I'm also going to add some texture near the mouth. And notice how even here, I'm not just tracing the lines of where the mouth will be, but I'm doing little horizontal tick marks so that it looks like there's hair and fuzz in this area. I'm going to get some of my alizarin crimson. I'm going to add the smallest amount of Payne's gray to it so it's not so bright. And I'm going to paint my first layer on the nose. Now the nose is a very small shape. So again, if you have too much paint on your brush, it's going to be hard to keep in the lines. So try not to overload your brush too much. And I'm just going to soak up any puddling of paint before I move on. I'm going to use this same color in the ears of the kitten. If anything feels a little too dark, you can just tap with a paper towel to soften it. I'm going to add more Payne's Gray to my mixture so it's closer to more of a solid black. I made sure to tap my paper towel or sponge before coming in to do these lines because I want them to be nice and narrow. Right down through the center of the mouth, it should be darker. So I'm just adding a layer there as well. In just a couple of areas of the stripe, I'll add some of this black. It's actually Payne's Gray, but I'm not doing it everywhere. Very, very selective. Right below the hat where we should have some shadow. I'm making a point to be willing to darken the color up a bit. Just the tiniest bit of black in a couple areas of the toes. Darken up some parts of the ear. If there's any areas that feel a little too dark, just do a light blot with a paper towel. I'm now going to switch to a number 1 round. I want a small brush that gives me confidence to get into small, tight spaces. And I'm going to be working on the nose now. So I'm going to create the nostril curve. It is very, very subtle. And that nostril curve is going to meet up with the side edge of the nose and come down in a vertical line. I'm going to do that on both sides. So it kind of reminds me of the shape of a candy cane or an upside J. And then we have a V shape right at the bottom of the nose. Like any animal, we always have kind of this crease down the center. And then we have these subtle little diagonal lines, very short, for the very edges of the nostrils. And then I want this kitten's nose to be kind of black on the top edge. I'm going to let that layer dry. I'm going to hit my fur with a blow dryer so I can take the masking fluid off the hat. Removing the masking fluid. Since my paint is dry, I don't run the risk of smearing anything. But you'll notice wherever I drag this rubber cement pickup, it does want to smear the pencil. I'm just going to reestablish some of the lines that I lost during removing the masking fluid, because that's very, very common. Now I'm going to mix up a really vibrant blue for the hat. And I'm going to do that using both the cerulean blue and the ultramarine blue. So I'm going pretty 50-50 between the two. So the color for my hat is going to be something about this. I'm going to rinse all the paint out of my brush. And I'm going to use just clean water. And I'm going to apply clean water to the inside of my kitten's hat. I'm going all over. I really slow down when I'm up against my edges, taking my time. All right, once everything is really glossy, I want to dry my brush and soak up any puddling of water, because that's just going to make it hard for me to control where my paint goes. It's also going to further dilute my colors. So if I want a vibrant blue, I want just a thin layer of water, nothing too thick. Now I'm going to grab that vibrant blue I mixed up, and I'm going to start with just the edges of the hat, making sure to kind of get some texture on the little pom-pom at the end of the hat. And I feel like my color still isn't as vibrant as I would like, so I'm adding more pigment to my mixture because the water on the surface here is diluting my color. And that's normal. But if I want a vibrant blue that isn't washed out once it dries, I'm going to get more pigment. I'm going to rotate my painting just to make sure I can get up against some of these edges with ease, and I don't run the risk of getting outside my shape. Now I have some areas where I have puddling of paint, so I'm going to dry and rinse my brush. And I'm going to use my dry brush to soak up the puddling paint just so it dries faster and more predictably. If I let these standing puddles of paint remain while I work on other areas, through the drying process, wherever a puddle is, it will be the last to dry, but it will create a bloom into the rest of this area. And I don't want an unexpected bloom, so I have to make sure the paint level throughout the hat is even. So through the drying process, it doesn't bloom on me. And I have a small area where just a little bit of blue paint splattered onto the cat. So I'm just lifting that with a little bit of water. All right, I'm going to let that first layer on the hat dry. Meanwhile, I'm going to return to the kitten's nose and give a little bit more color there. So I'm grabbing some more alizarin crimson. I like the idea of my little kitten nose standing out a bit more. So I'm applying a glaze over top. Taking my time. Now at the bottom portion of my kitten's nose, I want it to be more of a black. So while this alizarin crimson is wet, I'm coming in with some Payne's Gray just to create some darker coloring at the bottom of the nose. And I'm going to now give that some space to dry. I don't like watching paint dry, so I'm going to hit this with a blow dryer. All right, my hat is dry. However, now that it's dry, because of the dark colors I used on the hat, it's difficult for me to see some of my lines. So I'm just taking a moment to go through and try and reestablish some of the lines I have on this hat. If I need to, I can refer back to my line drawing to guide me. But I much rather kind of go into this next stage of the hat with confidence, knowing where everything should be, versus guessing midway. So now I'm going to use water to lift some of the color along the top edge of the hat. I'm going to have a clean paper towel handy to kind of blot and pick up any color that I lift. But I want to just kind of bring some parts of this knitted hat forward. So I'm going to go right to the top edge of this forward section of the hat, and I'm just lifting a little bit of the color by dragging a wet brush across the top. And it doesn't have to be a lot of pressure. You'll find that this color will lift very easily. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I can do the same thing in the back section of the hat. Just a damp brush, dragging across parts just to give a little bit more definition. And I'm barely applying any pressure. I'm just taking a little bit of water to some of these seams. It's just kind of an easy way to create some highlights. Now I'm going to go ahead and get my dark, vibrant blue that I used on the hat initially. I'm going to pull some of that aside. So I'm going to use my brush to pull some aside and add some Payne's gray to it so it's darker. I might add a little bit more blue so it's not such a drastic difference. A little bit more yet. So it kind of creates more of this navy blue color. So not quite black, but more navy blue. And now I can choose to kind of just add some texture. There were some lines on the line drawing that you can use for inspiration, but in reality, as long as you just kind of create some lines, then it's going to read like a hat. So it doesn't have to be perfect. I'm just kind of thinking of some V shapes, and each section is a little different. So I'm not putting a ton of pressure on myself to be, perfect, indicating every stitch. And I'm just using very light pressure, holding my brush as vertical as I can. And I'm making sure that my brush isn't overloaded with too much paint so that I'm able to kind of get this thin line work. I'm going to continue adding more texture to the back portion of the hat. And then on the pom-pom here, I'm just going to be using dots to add some texture. And notice how some of my dots are creating little groupings, creating some fun shapes in the shadows of the hat. And as I reach the outer section of the pom-pom, my shadows and dotting becomes more sparing and wider spaced. Now I'm going to go ahead and bring in some bright whites to brighten up just a few select areas of the cat's fur before I add the finishing whiskers. I also want to darken up the shadow beneath the cat to give a little bit more contrast. So using that dark, vibrant blue, I'm going to actually come in with a small brush darken up some of the shadow here underneath my kitten. Before this paint stroke dries, I'm coming in with a damp brush along the bottom edge just to soften that shadow. I'm not doing a lot of pressure. I don't want to gouge the previous layers. Just softening it just ever so slightly. I'm going to continue with this really dark shadow color. Before that dries, I'm going to come in with just a damp brush along that bottom edge, softening it ever so slightly. Notice how my paintbrush is not going into the paint stroke, just right up to that edge. If I go into the paint stroke, then I'm just going to lift the shadow. I don't want to do that. So I'm just focusing on that bottom edge. Okay, now I'm going to get to the opaque white. This is what I like to use. A white gouache or titanium white watercolor could also work. They just may not be as opaque. So this is a white that I've come to love, and I always have it at my side. And you can find a name of this in the video description as well. So I just put a little bit on my palette. And I don't want to water it down as much as watercolors. And I don't want to overload my brush or my paint strokes will be too wide. But my goal is that then use this bright white right on the upper edge of my paw where I could see a little bit of my pencil lines. I'm just adding a little bit of this white paint to kind of hide it. I can do the same thing along the edge of the head. If I can see some of my pencil lines there, I can just use some of this white to brighten some of that up. I can do the same thing on the ear. You can just add some longer little fur textures. Right along the bottom edge of the head if I want it to look a little fluffier. I can add some of these whites. Same with around the paw. Now, once the shadow color is completely dry, you can continue with your white to create little fur texture just over top of that blue. And it's just kind of a fun way to add some extra texture. Add some little fuzz to the bottom of the chin. If you feel like there are areas on the back of the cat where things got a little too gray, you can add just a few little textures of white just to break it up a bit. And then the last detail I plan on adding is just darkening up those nostrils, making them more of a black. But I want these marks to be very, very tiny. I do not want them to be big, so I make sure to wipe off my brush really good after it's loaded with paint. It's just a very narrow diamond or almond shape. Lastly, we need to add some whiskers to our kitten. So I'm going to switch to a small number 2 round that has a good quality point on it. And before I go straight to my painting, if you don't have experience painting thin lines, you should get a scrap piece of paper, load your brush, make sure to tap a sponge or paper towel just before practice, and just hold your brush very vertical and practice having a light touch so you know approximately how it should feel when you go to paint your whiskers. If you find that painting these thin lines is challenging, you can always use a micron pen and just use a pen to add the whiskers. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint mine. I'm actually going to start with a more watered down color so it's not as dark. After I load my brush with the paint, I'm just going to lightly tap my paintbrush on a paper towel so it's not overloaded. And I'm going to go to the cheek of my kitten. And I'm going to start on the cheek. And as I pull away from the nose, I'm going to lift up and away from my paper. And I'm going to try and do this in one stroke. If it's a little short, that's okay. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to do a new whisker. Okay. So I start at a new location and I go up and away. I can rotate my painting. I find that pulling a line towards my torso often feels a little bit more natural. So if I need to make a whisker longer, I can just kind of rotate my painting so it's a little easier. I'm going to add a couple whiskers on the opposite side. These whiskers are probably going to be smushed. So I'm just adding a couple. Now I can grab some of my white, my opaque white. I don't want to overload my brush, so I tap a sponge or paper towel. And I want to add just a couple little brow whiskers on this kitten. So I'm going to start just above where the tear duct area might be, near that stripe. I'm just going to add a couple whiskers. I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite brow. If I want, I can also add some white whiskers to the cheek of my kitten. So I can add a couple on the ground or near the ground. And then for this cheek, I might choose to rotate my painting. So I'm pulling towards myself. All right, and I think this completes our little kitten. I hope you all have a fantastic New Year's. Be safe, enjoy your family, and I can't wait to paint with you again next week.